The Sony A7 IV. Is it a better camera to buy than the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro? This is part one of a two-part series comparing the A7 IV and the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro, and then deciding which one is the best out of the two for you to go out and buy. In this first section, we'll be looking at the pros of the A7 IV, and in part two, we'll be looking at the pros of the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro. Now, when I initially recorded this video, I actually intended it to be one long film. However, once I got editing, I realized it was just far too long and it made more sense to split it into two. So you're going to suddenly see me change clothes now as we go back to previous John talking about the pros of the A7 IV. Enjoy. Today we are looking at two of my favorite cameras ever made. Two cameras that we have used a ton on productions in the UK and abroad. The Sony A7 IV and the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro. Now I think it's really interesting to compare these two cameras because they are effectively very much in the same price range. So if you're looking to upgrade your camera, or maybe you want to switch platforms, or you're just getting into filmmaking, it's very likely that you're going to look at either of these two as your next camera. First off, let's talk about the similarities. Well, of course, there is the price. The price is the one thing that they are very similar on. And depending on where you get them and depending on what deals they're currently on, one may be cheaper than the other. I think generally you'll probably find the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro will be cheaper, although once you factor in buying all the accessories that you may need, it may end up working out about the same. The only other real similarity both cameras have, other than both having excellent image quality, is the fact that they both top out at 60p when shooting in a Super 35 sensor mode. Now, of course, with Blackmagic, that is the largest the sensor can go, while with the Sony, of course, it is cropping in on that full frame sensor. Speaking of the full frame sensor, that is certainly Sony's first big advantage over the Pocket 6K Pro. Although full frame isn't necessary for filmmaking, and certainly not a reason to dismiss a camera if it doesn't have it, it can be very useful. The full frame sensor definitely helps when you're in a smaller space and you want to blur out the background, for example. And of course, having that bigger sensor helps a lot with low light, as there's more room for the pixels. Sort of linked to full frame is the lens choices. Now, of course, the Blackmagic has EF mount, which is great, and there's hundreds of lenses for that system. However, being Super 35, being a crop sensor, does limit you, certainly at the wide end. With the Sony A7 IV's full frame sensor, you can easily pick up a 24-70 2.8 lens, and to be honest, that lens can cover you for everything. I've mentioned in other videos how I absolutely love the Sigma version of this lens for Sony. I just use it all the time. You can use it for interviews, as 2.8 is blurry enough for most interviews. The range is good, nice and wide when you need it, and 70 is often long enough for a lot of corporate work. Sadly, in Super 35 world and with the Blackmagic, there's just nothing really equivalent to that. Yes, you've got great lenses like the Sigma 18-35, which I absolutely love the look of, but it is very limiting, only going up to 35. If it could go up to 50, that would be great, and it certainly would be much more usable and would be a much more equivalent lens to the 24-70 we see on the Sony. The Sony autofocus is absolutely incredible. I mean, once you've used it, it is really hard to go back. Yes, you don't want to use autofocus all the time, and often there are creative choices where you might not want to use autofocus. But I have to say, just having the option there for really good eye autofocus, say during an interview or while on a gimbal, it's just so useful to have. Not using autofocus doesn't make you a proper filmmaker. Using autofocus in a professional environment makes a ton of sense. Why make your job harder when there's technology that exists to make it easier for you? By using autofocus, it means you can focus on other things. You can make sure the composition is good. You can make sure the lighting is good. You can make sure the sound is good. When you're a one-man band, there's so many things you need to look out for. And it just is a lot easier when you know the focus is dead on at all times. Like autofocus, in-body stabilization is one of those things that once you've used it, it is really hard to go back. It's not always perfect, and there can be maybe situations where you don't want to use a camera with in-body stabilization. That said, I think for most shoots and most situations, it is actually very, very useful. It means you can keep the camera body a lot smaller. You don't need to be adding all that additional weight to add stabilization to your handheld shots. It just speeds up the entire process. It ensures that whichever lens you put on, you know you're not going to get those horrible little micro jitters that you often find if you try and shoot with a medium to long telephoto lens on a camera that doesn't have stabilization. Now, the Blackmagic has had the recent gyro stabilization update, which is awesome, and it's amazing how Blackmagic keep adding those features into the camera, and it certainly helps a lot. It certainly improves the options for the Blackmagic 6K, and with its large resolution, you don't really have any concerns about resolution loss when cropping in. However, it does crop in, and that can be frustrating. It's an extra step in the process. Although very simple, it is extra work that you have to do in post-production, and you have to factor in that crop that will happen. If there's one reason why you should go for the Sony A7 IV over the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro, it would be the battery life. Although it's much improved the battery life on the 6K Pro over the 4K and the original 6K, it's still not that great. With the Sony A7 IV, you can easily get through a whole day shoot with just 3 batteries. While with the Blackmagic camera, unfortunately, you need, I think, at least 8 batteries to be safe. Maybe more if you think you're going to do a lot of shooting. Now, of course, with all those batteries, it is more of a pain with charging. And I have actually made a custom charging rig, which you can check out the video above where I did that. It certainly helps and it makes life a lot easier, but it's just frustrating that you have to do things like that. With the Sonys, it's just so simple. Charging up 2 or 3 batteries each night is much more easier than trying to charge 8. If you do video production as a job, you'll be well aware that file sizes really do matter. You often hear people, certainly hobbyists, talk about how they just want the ultimate quality. They always want the absolute best picture quality. And that's great. If you've got all the time in the world, that's not a problem. However, when you see how TV production works, how news production works, and how a lot of corporate works, you soon realize there really isn't the time to be copying these huge 6K files for every single job that you do. Often the videos will end up just being used in HD on an intranet or on YouTube, and it's just really not necessary to have such high resolution files. With the Sony A7 IV, the files are much more compressed, and you would think that's a bad thing, but no, the quality is really good. Now that we have 10-bit color, it's not really a concern like in the past. Also, if you're shooting on one of the new M1 Max, and certainly as we transition into those sort of systems in the future, being able to shoot in H.265, which is even more compressed, smaller file sizes with better quality, and much easier to back up online, share with remote editors. There's just many good reasons why you would want to go for smaller file sizes over the large raw files of the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro. Not to mention, you also have the option to record proxies inside the camera of the Sony A7 IV, saving one other step in case you wanted to send proxies to a remote editor. Everyone knows Sonys are brilliant for low light. It's been their thing the entire time, and the A7 IV is no different. Now, I have found that the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro is actually pretty good in low light. I've not had many situations with the 6K Pro where I felt that it wasn't good enough for a corporate shoot. Personally, I'd rather add a bit of light if it is really that dark. That said, if you want something that's really good in low light, it's impossible to beat the Sony in this price bracket. Now, we may be talking about filmmaking, but more and more nowadays, clients are asking for a hybrid solution. Now, although I would never suggest you should try and do both filming and photography by yourself on one camera on the same shoot day, I always think they should be separate. The A7 IV is a brilliant photography camera, which means you've got one camera that can do 2 jobs. Now, you can take stills on the Blackmagic 6K Pro, and I've done that in the past, and I've taken stills from the raw files, and because they're 6K, it's effectively 18 megapixels, so actually they're pretty damn good. That said though, you just can't be a proper photography camera with great autofocus and a full frame sensor and a much higher megapixel. It just means you get much better results for your clients. Another cool feature of the A7 IV is its ability to act as a webcam. It may seem like a simple thing and not really that important, but hey, why not make your Zoom calls just look that bit better? Or maybe you might have a client that just needs a very, very simple live streaming setup, where perhaps they want to do a live presentation to their customers or their employees. And you know what? A simple setup like that might be more than enough. You don't necessarily need a big mixing rig for doing something that simple. Now, of course, Blackmagic have the wonderful A7iv series, and the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro integrates incredibly well with that. So if you're doing multicam, I think the 6K Pro would be a lot better at it for live streaming. However, if it's just going to be a single simple camera setup, the webcam feature in the A7 IV is excellent. Personally, I think size matters. And what I mean by that is smaller is better. Yes, the A7 IV might not look like a big filmmaking camera, but nor does the Blackmagic camera, to be honest. It's just a slightly awkward shape. And yeah, you can just about get it on a gimbal, however it is a lot heavier and much more awkward to balance. With the A7 IV being so much lighter and smaller, it is just much easier to balance. And because you only really need one lens with the camera, it means you can take up less space in your bag. Finally, the A7 IV comes with a built-in viewfinder. Now, of course, you can buy the one for the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro, and it's pretty good, but I would say the built-in one on the A7 IV is much better. Some people aren't a fan of viewfinders, they don't like the fixed position, but personally I find them quite useful for both filming and photography. It's that additional point of contact which just helps with stabilisation, but also seeing it in bright conditions. It's not the best viewfinder in the world, the Canons definitely do a lot better when it comes to viewfinders compared to Sony, but it's certainly better than what you get in the Blackmagic camera. So there you go, there are the pros of the A7 IV over the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro. Let me know what you think below in the comment section, and also make sure you subscribe because there'll be part 2 coming along soon where I'll be talking about why the Pocket 6K Pro might be better than the A7 IV, along with my final conclusions over which camera is best to buy for you.